Hello, what's up? This video contains full spoilers for both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. You have been warned. Also, while I have your attention, I'm going to stand on my soapbox for a second. Regardless of how anyone might feel about this game, we can all agree that the crunch culture in the gaming industry is absolutely abhorrent and is much more deserving of our complaints and our negative attention than anything inside a video game ever could be, because that is real, my friends. Please keep that in mind. I hope you enjoy the video. Goodbye. Hi, hello, it's been a minute, and I don't know if this is the best video to make, because I don't know if there's anything left to say about The Last of Us Part 2 that hasn't already been screamed by an internet mob at another internet mob. Seriously, the discourse around this game has been so damn toxic. But what is YouTube if not a way for us to scream our thoughts into the void, even if nobody actually gives a shit? So The Last of Us Part 2 has been the topic of an ongoing culture war on the internet ever since some leaks about this game came out from a disgruntled ex-employee. When you talk about this game online, it's really hard to know who is actually just being genuine about their thoughts on a video game, who is using this video game and the discourse around it as a means to spew some thinly veiled political antagonism, and who is just being outright bigoted. Well, that one's a little bit easier to tell because, you know, they're not very good at hiding it, but it's tough these days. So before I start talking about the game, I just want to make my stance absolutely crystal clear. If you, in your criticism of this game, have used the talking points of forced diversity, SJWs, and muscular woman bad, then you do not deserve to be taken seriously, and your opinions are not serious criticisms. They are the mewlings of a child. They are childish at best or outright bigoted at worst. If hearing that pisses you off, then this is probably a waste of your time. So just save both of us the trouble and do something else. Okay, so The Last of Us takes place in a post-apocalyptic society run over by zombies, but not like the reanimated from the dead kind. We're talking like the infected kind. So you get an infection called cordyceps, and then you turn into a mushroom-headed freak, alright? So this dude named Joel lost his daughter at the beginning of the apocalypse, and now 20 years later, he's like a super hardened, super violent dude. He's got like no conscience, and he's a smuggler. So he gets told to smuggle this young girl named Ellie across the country because she's immune, and they think they might be able to get a cure off of her. So he does it, and of course he gets super attached to her, and then they get to the end of the journey, and he finds out, hey, if we want to get a cure, we're gonna have to kill her to get it. And he goes, fuck that, not again, and he murders everybody, and he gets the fuck out of there. And he tells her that they couldn't find a cure from her because she was out cold the whole time. She didn't actually know what happened. So that's what happens. It ends with like a pretty situation. In The Last of Us Part 2, it turns out one of the people he murdered had a daughter named Abby. She spent the last 4 years tracking him down and finds him and kills him with a golf club right in front of Ellie. Ellie freaks the fuck out.
You're gonna fucking die!
Goes to Seattle to track Abby down, kills a bunch of people. But right before she gets to Abby, Abby gets to her. But before they fight, we actually play the same few days again as Abby, and we see her point of view. We see that she is a member of a faction called the Wolves, who is in conflict over Seattle with another faction called the Seraphites. She's a soldier. She has all these friends and shit who we kind of just killed as Ellie. But anyways, Abby goes from being a loyal soldier to being kind of iffy on the whole war thing when she meets these two young Seraphites named Lev and Yara, and she gets attached to them a little bit and becomes disillusioned with the whole thing and finds herself fighting her own people to defend Lev and Yara, who she now cares about a lot. And after all this, she sees that Ellie killed all her friends, tracks Ellie down, and now we're back in the present. They fight for a bit, but Abby decides to let Ellie go. And a couple of years in the future, Ellie gets another trail about where Abby is and then tracks her down again. This time she finds that Abby has been captured by slavers, and she cuts her down. Abby's like a total fucking mess at this point, right? She's not in good shape, but Ellie can't let her go. She tries to fight her, but at the crucial moment, she doesn't finish the job, and this time she lets Abby go. And interspersed with this, there are flashbacks of some of the major beats that she had with Joel during the missing years between the two games. Okay, I think that's all the important stuff here. So The Last of Us Part 1 is actually my favorite game. Although I'm not actually the biggest gamer in the world, I'm more of a reader, which if you look at my other videos isn't really a surprise, but that's kind of where I'm at. So it's not really a surprise that my favorite game would be a very heavily narrative-driven game like The Last of Us, with lots of production value and character writing and stuff like that, and less of an emphasis on super complex gameplay. So this game makes the controversial decision to kill off one of the protagonists of the first game, Joel, very early on, basically in the prologue. Now, that was always going to be controversial. It was never not going to be controversial. But for me, when I see something like that happen early on in a story especially, my reaction is not outrage or anything of the like. It's usually just like, what direction are they going to go in? What's the fallout of this decision going to be? And honestly, when it comes to Joel's death, I thought it was actually handled really well for the most part, and I'll go into more detail about why I think so. I didn't have a single issue with Joel dying in the first 2 and a bit hours. The way I see things, the main resolution we needed with Joel was the fallout of his decision at the end of the first game and the lies he told to Ellie at the end of the first game. And we weren't robbed of the resolution to that conflict. We did get it throughout the game through flashbacks, but we did get it. So, see, what I find fascinating about this decision is, obviously Joel and Ellie were our eyes into this world. Through the first game and the beginning of the second game, they were the ones we connected to. So when we see Joel get brutally murdered in front of Ellie, inevitably it is going to put us in Ellie's shoes. She is obviously traumatized and deeply upset by that experience, and we, ignoring the leaks, of course, which let a lot of people know it was coming early, we would be shocked and upset by that experience as well. Immediately, both Ellie and the audience have this righteous anger towards Joel's killer.
You're gonna fucking die!
And of course, the story shapes up like a classic revenge story, with Ellie traveling across the country to find the people who did this and bring them to justice. But as we go on that journey and we see the fruits of this righteous anger, both Ellie and the audience, again being put in the same shoes, are made more and more uncomfortable by what that actually entails. This is also compounded with some flashback sequences where we learn some of the crucial details about Joel and Ellie's relationship during the missing years between the two games, and we find out that she actually knew what Joel did, and it adds more complexity, disappointment, conflict in how we see Ellie and her journey, especially when you contrast it with the horrible things that she's actually doing in pursuit of this. Now, this climaxes with Ellie killing a pregnant woman, which obviously has some parallels with her own relationship with Dina. And as the audience, we at this point are probably very uncomfortable with the things she's doing, and that kind of butters us up for Abby to come right back into the story at the moment at which we are most unsure. And when she comes back, instead of being this faceless boogeyman that we've been chasing for half the game, what she says is very human. She says, what? We let you go and you wasted it, and you killed my friends. She sounds hurt. This isn't a monster, this is a human being. It's a story designed to make you feel very conflicted. But that's led to a very confusing narrative that I've seen take shape on the internet since this game has come out. And I genuinely don't understand it at all. So the narrative that I've seen is that this game is bad, and this narrative is bad, and the story they're telling about, revenge being bad is bad because the game forces you to do bad things and then chastises you for it. It doesn't give you a choice, and then it chastises you for doing the things that they didn't give you a choice in doing. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills because that doesn't make any sense. Now, normally I'm very willing to just be like, hey man, difference of opinion, it is what it is. But in this scenario, I genuinely feel like I'm taking crazy pills because I don't understand this argument at all. The Last of Us is a narrative-driven story. The characters in this game are characters. They are not you or me. Yes, like any narrative, you are in their shoes to an extent because, we're people and we empathize. But it is not us suffering the consequences of Ellie's actions. It is Ellie suffering the consequences of Ellie's actions. Now, by playing as Ellie, we are put in the uncomfortable position of having to do some of these very, very unsavory things, and that part is totally true. But it isn't us being chastised for those actions. It's Ellie being chastised for those actions. Also, before I move on, can we just talk about this comment and how it's an intentional misinterpretation of everything that happened in the game? And this is the type of shit that you see getting upvoted and becoming the dominant narrative, right? The game tries to paint Ellie as this dog-killing monster, when if you actually look at what happens, she falls on her ass and the dog comes at her, so she has a choice between kill the dog or fucking die. And then the writers try to manipulate you into liking Abby. Writers try to manipulate the audience to feel things? How dare they? Like, that's literally what storytelling is. It's the writers trying to emotionally manipulate you to try to make you feel certain things. But this time they've gone too far because they dared to try and show positive traits of the antagonist who killed Joel. Of course. The only reasonable interpretation that you could take from this situation is that Ellie killing the dog is one of many bad things that she does as a consequence of her chasing this revenge so single-mindedly. Also, please don't go find this person's Reddit account and start calling them out or harassing them or anything. It's really bad form. I'm just using this comment as an example. That's all it is. Thank you very much. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. In fact, I would say that if you feel uncomfortable by the things that you do in this game, the game is actually vindicating those emotions that you felt. The game is saying, yes, you shouldn't be doing this shit. You shouldn't be okay with it, right? And like Ellie suffers for her actions. So to feel that it's a personal attack on you, I think is completely getting the narrative backwards. I mean, I genuinely don't understand. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, right? So there's a scene where Ellie beats the shit out of and murders this girl named Nora. You have to beat the shit out of her. You have to press square to hit her, and you have to do it multiple times, right? The game forces you, it doesn't give you a choice. Now, what's interesting about the way this scene plays out, though, is unlike most of the game, which takes place over Ellie's shoulder, right? You're looking over her shoulder and controlling the environment. If you have to press square to, melee somebody. In this scene, you are not looking over her shoulder down at this person you're killing. You're looking up at Ellie from Nora's perspective. So you're essentially pressing square to beat the shit out of yourself at this point. And the camera is very much focused on Ellie and her reaction throughout this entire sequence. Every time you press square, it doesn't focus on the crowbar's movement. It doesn't show you what happens to Nora. It's squarely focused on Ellie and what she is feeling through her facial expressions while she does this. And to me, this is like a microcosm of this entire story, right? It's showing you what these actions are doing to someone. It's putting you in this uncomfortable position of having to press square, but what that really does is it forces you to interact with this story. You can't look away. You can't wait till it's over. You have to be a part of this. You have to look and see what it actually does to the character. And ultimately, it is about the character. It isn't you. I just want to say that again because I don't understand it. Hi, hello. So I realized while editing this video that there's probably a couple things I should expand on a little bit. So art is in this weird place where it's both a commodity and also an art form. And as consumers of a commodity, we have every right to just dismiss it out of hand because it's not what we wanted. Especially when you consider that this shit costs money. And even if it didn't cost money, it would cost time. So of course, if you're not going to get what you want, why should you spend your hard-earned money and your precious spare time on this thing? I totally understand that, and I totally will not judge if you're just like, you know what? I'm just not interested anymore. I get it. But I don't think that in itself is a valid critique of art. When you're critiquing art, I think it's important to look at what it is and what it wants to say and judge it on the merits of the story that it wants to tell you. When it comes to sequels, I don't think that the expectations of the fans actually really matter. I don't think that it should play a part in judging the actual quality of the story. So I think a lot of the, they did the fans dirty type conversations and accusations that people are having, while I get it from the point of view of a consumer, I just don't think it holds any weight when we're actually judging the story. So the game makes another controversial decision at the halfway points where instead of resolving this climax with Abby and Ellie, it just goes, haha, fuck you, and turns the clock back 3 days. It makes you play basically that entire time period again as Abby. So like half the game is about a character who is not Joel or Ellie. That was always going to be controversial, but not necessarily a bad thing. Like controversial, of course, some people are not going to like that, but in terms of, is it actually a good decision or a bad decision? I don't think it's a bad decision, at least not by definition. Showing the antagonist's point of view in a narrative is not a new strategy. We see it all the time in all kinds of stories and all kinds of media. Maybe not so much in video games. I don't know how many there are that have pulled this move off. Like I said, not the biggest gamer in the world, but I didn't have a problem with it. And since this is a video game, it has the unique narrative tool of actually having you play as the character that they're trying to get you to empathize with and understand. In other mediums, you wouldn't have that tool. You would just read about them or see them or whatever. But in a video game, that is not the best way to convey the narrative, to use the tools you have available to you. You have gameplay at your disposal, a way to directly get the audience to interact with this character and force them to put themselves in the character's shoes, even if they don't want to at first. So of course, you have to use that tool. It would be stupid if they didn't. So through playing as Abby, you discover in a very unsubtle way that Abby and Ellie are not really all that different. They're a lot more similar than they are different. And through that, we come to the natural conclusion that the real villain here, the real evil here, and this is going to sound super cheesy, but the real villain is revenge itself. I mean, if you look, the parallels between the two are all over the place, right? Abby's got a thing with zebras. Ellie's got a thing with giraffes. Abby's got an uncomfortable love triangle involving a pregnant lady. Ellie's got an uncomfortable love triangle involving a pregnant lady.
Oh my god. Jesse.
Hey,
The fucking pose. Abby loves to read books. Ellie loves to read comic books. And of course, they both suffered the loss, the painful and tragic loss of a father figure in their life. In Abby's case, literally her dad. In Ellie's case, it was Joel. Honestly, the biggest difference between the two is timing. Abby suffered her loss a long time ago, and she's gone through multiple stages of coping with that loss. One of which includes getting fucking swole and getting built like a brick shithouse. One of the ways people cope with loss and the feeling of powerlessness that it creates is by getting physically stronger, and that way they can exert influence and power over their surroundings. So of course, while she's physically training so she can physically kill Joel in a very straightforward sense, there's a psychological motivation for it as well. The other difference, obviously, is that she already got her revenge, whereas Ellie, as of this game, is still on the journey towards getting it. And we can see that getting that revenge did not bring Abby any peace. There's this dream sequence, or nightmare sequence more accurately, that Abby has multiple times in the game where she's walking through the halls of the hospital and she walks into the surgery room and her dad is dead. We play through that multiple times after she's already taken Joel out, right? She's not at peace with what happened just because Joel is dead. In fact, you could say that it did literally nothing for her, because the very first time we see her in the game, when she's still chasing Joel, she wakes up from a nightmare. And it's not really much of a mystery what nightmare that is. She actually has the same dream later on, but instead of seeing her dad dead, she sees Lev and Yara hanging from a tree, I think. And it isn't until she decides to help them, and through helping them, becomes disillusioned with this arbitrary conflict based on arbitrary lines in the sand, in a fucking post-apocalypse where everything is scarce. It isn't until she becomes disillusioned with all that and genuinely connects to someone that she's able to truly move on past her loss. Lev and Yara represent a chance to transcend the cycle of hate that she's found herself in and find some personal sense of redemption. And once she does help them, she has this dream sequence one more time, but this time at the end, her dad is alive and well. This makes the game's point pretty clearly, which is that it's only through pursuing a journey of compassion and forgiveness that we can truly find closure for our loss and trauma. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I found myself getting really invested in Abby's character arc. By the time we were in day 3, I was like straight up on her side. You know that part where she's like, you're my people.
Come on, those were your fucking people. You're my people.
Bro, that shit hits, bro. That's a fucking banger. You can't tell me that shit didn't hit. I'm sorry, but... And I really appreciate the way that her arc mirrors Ellie and Joel in different ways. When we meet her, she's kind of broken down and cynical and violent as fuck, the way Joel is, and she finds a bit of personal redemption by helping this young kid. Obviously in Joel's case it was Ellie, but in her case it's Lev. So when she sees what Ellie has done, her natural instinct is to regress, and while Lev is down to help her to an extent, when she is on the verge of crossing that line and killing a pregnant woman, Lev is the one who pulls her out of that place. And honestly, it makes sense. Just earlier that day, Mel was chastising her and making her feel like shit for all of the violent things she'd done in the past, things that even she now was realizing did not bring her closure. Mel was saying that her actions would get those 2 kids killed, and she wasn't exactly right about that, but she was damn close because it ended up getting her and Owen killed. So with that moment of clarity, she moves on. And this is basically the opposite of what Ellie does. Ellie refuses to learn any lesson whatsoever and goes on this single-minded path towards revenge. Even when Dina point blank is like, yo, they let your ass go, my guy. Her response is basically, shut the fuck up, right? Don't tell me that. I don't want to hear that. So, as a book nerd, I noticed a couple of book references that I want to point out before I move on. So in day 1 of Abby's storyline, in fact, I think it might have been the first scene, she's reading a book called City of Thieves by David Benioff. Yes, the Game of Thrones guy, calm the fuck down. But City of Thieves is set in World War II Russia in Leningrad, and it follows a guy named Lev, yes, that's right, a guy named Lev, literally, who meets a deserter and goes on a mission behind enemy lines. I'm not going to go into any more detail about it, but it's pretty clear foreshadowing for her meeting a deserter who is also named Lev and going on a mission behind enemy lines. Although, you know, Lev wasn't with her when she went behind enemy lines, but he was there when they were coming back out, so close enough, right? Also, if you're interested in historical fiction or coming of age stories at all, definitely read this book. It's fucking great. I don't care how you feel about the last season of Game of Thrones, this book is still awesome. Read it. The other reference that I noticed was there's a scene where she's talking to another wolf about the book The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Now this is a classic. It's been around for ages, but this is about a guy who gets wrongfully imprisoned and then he takes revenge on the people who screwed him. And then he finds out that revenge is not all that. Full disclosure, I haven't actually read this one, but it's one of those books that you hear a lot about if you spend time in like reader circles, because it gets talked about like every fucking day. But yeah, I thought those were pretty cool. So I just wanted to point that out for anyone who maybe didn't notice those references. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about hero worship. In the first game, we spend the entire story getting attached to Joel and Ellie. But the end of the game is not Joel heroically rescuing his daughter. It's not a righteous crusade of any kind. It is a selfish decision from a man who could not face loss. A man who was broken down by this world and couldn't stand to lose the one thing that gave his life any kind of meaning at that point. And so he did something unspeakably evil. In the context of The Last of Us, out of all the characters we've met, Joel's probably done more damage to the world than any of them, just by saving Ellie. It's fucking tragic, and the ending of The Last of Us is bittersweet because the characters we love, you know, they make it out, and they're together, and they lived happily ever after at the time, but at what cost though? Despite the fact that Joel is canonically a piece of shit, there's been a disturbing amount of romanticization of his actions, you know, the dadification of his actions, the hero worship of his actions. It's all part of one big old clusterfuck. I'm not saying everyone who likes Joel was doing this, because I think Joel's a fantastic and compelling character. I just would never excuse his actions. And I think Naughty Dog noticed this trend of romanticizing Joel's actions, and I think they wanted to directly confront it with the sequel. Obviously, on a direct level, those actions had major consequences because the violence that he initiated on that day came back to bite him in the ass, and the violence that Abby initiated in response to Joel came back to bite her in the ass, and the violence that Ellie committed in response to Abby came back to bite her in the ass. Obviously, that was a whole thing started by Joel. But I think even beyond that, the game is telling a story that is impossible to romanticize in that way. You can't not feel uncomfortable with the shit that you have to see and do in this game. There's no like, you know, oh man, he's a great dad factor or equivalent in this game. It's forcing you to confront the uncomfortable reality of the actions that some people, many people, have romanticized from the first game. And obviously the flip side of that is it also tries to get you to empathize with someone who you don't want to empathize with at first. And personally, I really connected to the moment right at the end when Ellie was about to kill Abby and then decided not to because of the flashback she had to her conversation with Joel. In that conversation, she says that she'll try to forgive him even though she doesn't think she actually ever can. But she's making the effort to try and bury the hatchet over the lies that Joel has told her.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
Up until that point, I thought a big part of the reason she was on this single-minded warpath was because she felt guilty about her final conversation with Joel being an argument. But that moment kind of recontextualizes everything, and it becomes clear that the reason she was so single-minded was nothing so simple. It was more about the fact that she was finally willing to try and move on, to try and bury that hatchet, and she had reconciliation taken from her against her will, right at that moment, right at that cusp of things turning around. Because regardless of how selfish it was and how furious she was at him for taking that decision away from her, he says he would do it all again in a heartbeat, essentially saying to her that her life is more important to him than humankind itself. And while that might not be ethical, it is definitely understandable. Her relationship with Joel ended up being very complicated. A lot of those layers were slowly revealed to us throughout the events of this game, but it isn't until she remembers that moment and that attempt to let things go that she realizes that's the only way forward. To try and forgive even if you don't think you can. Not because the other person deserves it, but because it's the only way that you can ever find peace of mind. It's the same thing Abby realized after she literally got her revenge. And it's something that Ellie wasn't able to realize until she was at that crucial moment. Because it's one thing to glamorize revenge when it's an abstract in your head. It's another thing to be actively holding someone's head below the water and have to put pressure on them with every passing second as they slowly lose their life. It's very different. Now, obviously, the counterpoint would be, hey, she killed a bunch of other people though, like Owen and Mel and Nora, and she did do that, but every time she did it, it just led to her being more emotionally conflicted and fucked up. It didn't actually solve anything. As it turned out, she did in the end need to go on a journey, but it wasn't a journey of revenge, it was a journey of forgiveness. And in order to successfully complete that journey, she had to find Abby and be in a position where she can make the choice to get revenge or to get forgiveness. God damn. You sound fucking psychotic. She sounds like SpongeBob when he was at Sandy's house, you know? I don't need it. I don't need it. I need it. And with the experience and the emotional turmoil that her revenge and violence up until this point has brought her with that knowledge. Even if she doesn't want to accept it, with that knowledge, she's finally able to close this chapter. This also closes off the cycle of forgiveness that we've seen in response to the cycle of violence that was maybe not started by Joel, but certainly perpetuated by Joel and led to all of the events in this game. I mean, if anyone started that cycle of violence, it was the dickhead that shot Sarah in the first game. But this cycle of forgiveness starts with Lev and Yara letting Abby go, and she in turn decides to help them, which eventually leads to her sparing Ellie, which eventually leads to Ellie coming to find her and actually saving her life instead of killing her. If Ellie never came for her at all, Abby just would have died right there. So when we do finally leave off with Ellie, it is a pretty somber send-off, but we see her walking out into the light, leaving behind the guitar Joel gave her, signifying that she's moved on. And while she is on her own at the house, she's wearing the bracelet Dina gave her, which is a hopeful sign for the future. Combine that with the fact that Abby and Lev most likely made it to the Fireflies after leaving the Rattler hideout, and we're left with the impression that there might actually be a light at the end of this very, very dark tunnel that we've been through. It's all just one big sort of, I'm going to use the word subversion of the sort of typical self-insert and romanticization that we kind of see in most video games. Ultimately, The Last of Us 2 is telling a much more ambitious story than the first game, but that's not to say that it does everything better. One thing that shouldn't be controversial is to say that this game has a lot more flaws than the first game, at least in terms of the narrative. One thing that jumps out pretty obviously is the pacing. The game is like 20 to 25 hours long. 25 for me because I'm bad, but it's like maybe twice as long as the first game. It's pretty fucking long, dude. And I'm not sure if it needed that entire runtime. It could have been more concise in the story that it told. One thing that jumps out is towards the end of the game, you have to like go to California for just like a couple hours, and you run into a whole other faction of like slavers and stuff that wasn't in the game before that. You know, could there have been a way to streamline that and make it more closely connected to the story in Seattle, which is where most of the game takes place? Probably. And also, obviously, there's this very jarring moment at the halfway point where you reach this climax and then go, haha, fuck you, and you have to replay the whole 3 days as Abby. Now, this is jarring for sure, but I think that by the time I got to the end, I appreciated the decision. I don't think they pulled it off perfectly. I'm not sure it could have been pulled off perfectly, but I understand why they did it. The game essentially sacrifices pacing for immersion in each character's journey. For us to be fully immersed in Ellie's journey as it is, you kind of need Abby to be this nameless, faceless entity that is always just out of arm's reach. You can't have her be too humanized, right? She makes a strong impression because she sews up, she's built like a fucking ox, and she beats the shit out of Joel, and then she's just gone. And instead of having this target to direct our anger towards, we have nothing to do but to reconcile the horrible things that we're watching Ellie doing in pursuit of this abstract revenge, relatively abstract, because Abby's not in the picture. And to get lost in Abby's storyline, you kind of need Ellie to be out of sight, out of mind for a little bit. She needs to be not involved, because at that point in Abby's life, she isn't involved. And then you get into the shit that Abby's up to, and you go through the exhausting events of day 3 of Abby's storyline. Holy shit, dude! Why won't you die? What is wrong with you? Going through all that crazy shit, losing your backpack with all the loot, and after going through all that, the betrayal and loss of coming home to seeing Mel and Owen fucking dead, it hits because there's some distance between when we actually did those things as Ellie and when we saw those things as Abby, right? We're seeing it relatively freshly through her eyes. I've seen a lot of people suggest that the story would have been better if it was shown chronologically, and while I kind of agreed when I was actually right in the aftermath of that jarring shift, by the time I got to the end, I kind of strongly disagreed. I don't think that the story as it is would have been better if it was in chronological order. Better paced? Probably. But as an overall narrative, would it have been stronger? I don't think so. There's also a very strong discrepancy between narrative and gameplay, right? So I've mentioned how Ellie's actions affect her when she murders people and shit, but in the gameplay, you're wasting people left, right, and center, probably fucking hundreds of bodies by the time you actually get to the end, and it's just like no problem, they don't count. And honestly, you know, this might be a problem for some people, but I genuinely don't see this as an issue. As far as I'm concerned, you know, other than like canon dialogue between her and Dina, other than stuff like that, I don't think that gameplay actions are canon to the narrative. What happens explicitly within the narrative context is canon to the narrative. The rest is gameplay. And there is one like plot hole or thing that doesn't make sense that I've been thinking about a few times, and I just don't understand it. How the fuck did Mel get to the aquarium? Like, we watched Abby go through some next level shit just to get to this damn place, and then fucking Mel shows up the next day like, yo, what's up, man? How you doing? How did her heavily pregnant ass get there? Did she get fucking dropped off by the entire wolves? Did she get a fucking escort? Like when my dad used to drop me off to high school? Is that what happened? Or did she like call up Littlefinger and borrow his teleporter? Like, what the fuck is going on here? How did she get there? Did I miss something? That's not out of the question, but please tell me if I did, because I genuinely don't fucking understand how she got there. But yeah, moral of the story, Last of Us 2, a lot more ambitious and with some really, really compelling high points, but also a lot more flawed than the first game. And it begs the question really of what makes a story worthwhile. Is reaching for the stars and finding inconsistent success of more artistic merits than doing something small and concise and pulling it off really well? Depends who you ask. Depends on how inconsistent is inconsistent. Now, to me, I still think the first game is better than the second game, but I do still think this is a very, very worthwhile sequel. And I think that it's going to age well. I think as time passes and the hysteria slowly disappears, people are going to look back on it and be like, you know what? Maybe it was better than we gave it credit for at first. And before I wrap things up, I just want to have a little bit of a discussion about Lev. Now, I want to say I actually really like Lev. I love the innocence and empathy that he represents in this story. I love his relationship with Abby and how it develops into this sort of brother-sister dynamic. And I'm glad to see an unambiguously trans character taking such a prominent role in a AAA game like this. But I think it would be extremely tone deaf for me, a cis person, to see Lev's existence in this game and declare it as a victory for trans people on their behalf. And it might surprise some of you to hear that there is actually a fairly wide range of opinions on Lev as a character. While he is well written for the most part, a lot of his story arc basically revolves around, hey, look how much it sucks to be trans. It is representation, but it's not exactly the type of representation most people want. Now, for me, the closest analogy I could make is maybe seeing a brown actor with a major role in a major film, but they're playing like a terrorist. Or maybe just like an Apu from The Simpsons, who is just a walking stereotype. So it's very easy to see why a lot of people might feel that this was not designed to represent trans people as they are, but rather to exhibit them and their pain like some kind of zoo animal for cis people to come in and point at and say, "Aw, poor them." Ultimately though, I don't think this is a situation that it's really my place to cast judgment on, other than to say that I like Lev a lot and I'm glad he exists. At the end of the day, this is a game that makes controversial decisions that were never going to be for everyone, let's be real. At the end of the day, they were always going to be very divisive, but taken on its own merits with all this added bullshit, you know, tossed to the side with the leaks and the co-opting by certain unsavory factions. And also, if we're being honest, taking aside the expectations placed upon it by the audience. If you judge the story on its own merits, it's a story that, even if you don't like it, which is totally fine, is deserving of respect. And I'm sorry for all the people who worked on this game, who had to put up with some absolute bullshit and some next level abuse. from people who, through their actions, are actually like vindicating the controversial decisions made by the game. I just want to expand on what I mean by that a little bit. Part of the game's story is about how tribalism erodes our humanity and robs us of our empathy. We can see this in the conflict between the WLF and the Seraphites. So for the game to be about that, and then for so many of the fans to turn around and cry about how it's a slap in the face to the fans and how dare they make you play as this person who did this horrible thing in a world where everyone does horrible things sometimes, but this is different because she did a horrible thing to Joel, and Joel is our guy. We're seeing people patently refusing to empathize on the grounds of what essentially amounts to tribalism. Now, it would be one thing if people were saying, oh, you know, the game just didn't work for me because of X, Y, and Z. And of course, a game this dark and violent and uncomfortable was never going to be for everyone to begin with. But for the most part, that's not what's happening.
Absolute dribble. You want to know why she left her alive?
Because the game's not over yet.
It's not Joel. It's not a man. It's a woman. The last of us women. I'm not going to kill you. That's my opinion, dude, because it's like, well, fuck all the fucking dudes in the fucking game. They all die. Fuck them, kill them, fuck them up. Now, all the women kill each other, and then they kill each other's friends, and then when they go to kill it, nah, live you live.
Again, what we're seeing is people acting like this is a slap in the face. Oh, this whole game was designed to spit on Joel. I can't remember who, but someone actually said that. Of course, that's a million miles away from people actually sending someone death threats. Sending people death threats over a video game is just unhinged, end of story. But the anger that those people sending the death threats felt is the same anger that I'm seeing from a lot of other people who are thankfully not unhinged. Anyways, if you played the game, how do you feel about it? If you haven't played the game, I mean, you know, not everyone has to play everything. I get it. There's a limited amount of time in the world, but maybe cool your personal sense of judgments for something that you haven't actually experienced. That's what I would say. That's my opinion. But I'm interested to hear people's thoughts, as long as they're civil. I don't know if anything I've said here has been new information to anyone who is watching this, but I hope that if you've made it this far, you enjoyed hearing my thoughts. If you didn't enjoy it, let me know how I can do better. If you did enjoy it, feel free to, you know, do all the stuff that you're supposed to do on a YouTube video. But hope you're having a great day. Trans rights are human rights. See you later.